What do you think success looks like for China's leadership?
Straightforwardly, by the year 2049, to achieve what they call the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese people. And what that means is that China will once again be the economic center of the world in some form, that China will have reclaimed the island nation of Taiwan, that China's near neighbors will feel the need to regularly go to the emperor in Beijing and kowtow for his pleasure. And that means that China will have to be a much richer and more powerful country than it is. I think there is something of a sense in Beijing that there is a great historical past that is represented by something like the peak of the Qing Empire, which controlled slightly more land than China does now. I think they want to achieve that, and then they want to feel like they are once more the center of the world, which they were for several hundred years in the last millennium.
Probably the biggest trend defining geopolitics today is the global competition between two superpowers, the United States and China. And despite America having many major advantages, China is increasingly managing to catch up with the US. And it has been able to do that from basically nothing, and in a record time. My guest today, Dan Wang, explains why was China able to do that and what that means for who will end up winning in the future. He is a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and author of the book Breakneck, where he argues that while the United States is led by lawyers, China is led by engineers. And that as a consequence of that, China is able to build with speed and scale that the US is struggling to catch up. But it's also why China tends to make pretty catastrophic decisions just as often as it makes the brilliant ones. It's a fascinating explanation of both of these two countries and their global competition. And we talk about what it means for their respective futures, who is better positioned to win the new Cold War, and much more. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes and additional bonus content. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, your core thesis that you present in Breakneck, which is an amazing book, by the way, is that although the American and Chinese societies are actually in many ways surprisingly similar, as you say, they are run by very different types of elites, which is why the two countries look very different today. And you say that China is run by engineers. What do you actually mean by that?
Starting from the 1980s, a lot of the composition of the top levels of the Politburo, which is the highest ruling echelon of the Communist Party, became formally trained in engineering. So Deng Xiaoping, after he took over from the chaos of the Mao years, decided that the answer to Mao's misrule was to have a lot of technocrats being in charge of everything from the economy to monetary policy to the environment to social planning. And so by the year 2002, every single member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo has had degrees in engineering of a very Soviet sort. So these were people trained in hydraulic engineering, electrical engineering, etc. So that's one dimension of how China is an engineering state. Another dimension is that if we take a look at the history of China, I don't want to be overly literal about this, but at various points, the emperors built great walls as well as grand canal systems. China is pretty much defined by these giant fortification or waterway management systems, and to a degree that I think fewer other countries are really, talking about these really big engineering triumphs. And then the other cut that I have on this question is that I think if we take a look at some of the big policies that the Communist Party has made over the last few decades, it almost resembles as if the engineers were treating society as if it were just another engineering exercise as well. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the one-child policy as well as zero COVID, which I lived through which the number's right there in the name. This is about very clear communication to all the cadres about what to do. They engineer the economy, for example, by trying to drive people out of the financial sector as well as the consumer tech sector into aviation or semiconductors instead. And they also engineer the physical environment just as well.
Right, that it's both physical and social engineering. And the way I understand your argument is basically that the engineering mindset China has is both good in some ways and has worked well for China, and bad in other ways, and that it can deliver both huge achievements and some pretty major failures, and both of those have happened. And one of the achievements that you write about, probably the main one that China has had thanks to this mindset, is that it emerged as basically a global leader in a number of technologies and industries. How did that actually happen?
Well, China was nicknamed as the workshop of the world, or the manufacturer of or the factory of the world. And it started out by making relatively simple goods throughout the 1980s of socks and textiles and t-shirts. That moved on to more sophisticated goods in the 90s as more American companies, European companies, Japanese companies started setting up their manufacturing operations in China, mostly to take advantage of cheap labor and lax environmental controls to build a lot of stuff, up until today, when China is still assembling the majority of the world's iPhones. It is putting together quite a lot of Tesla's vehicles at its gigafactory in Shanghai. And now China is just straightforwardly, I think, climbed a technological ladder in which they mastered simple products, kept inviting foreign companies in to teach Chinese workers to upgrade their skills in terms of bringing better managerial expertise, engineering experience, everything else, throwing that into the fierce churn of the very dynamic Chinese marketplace, which has produced quite a lot of companies on their own, and then working also together with a state that sometimes gets in their way and sometimes helps them out by making important investments. And I think that is kind of the process of turning China into a much stronger powerhouse, in part because the leadership is obsessed with technology, that they understood that their historical experience over the last 150 years has been one of, in their words, humiliation, because the foreigners had technology and they did not. And so it's good to have technology, and they need to really think a lot more about technology. I think every country would have national leaders that would profess that technology is important, but I think the Chinese really mean it, and many more of them have had technical training relative to, let's say, the Americans, and they really want to pursue some aspect of technological dominance. Doesn't mean that they're always going to get it. Doesn't mean that they don't often trip over themselves. But I think having this intent is still important for understanding what's going on in China.
So one thing that I find really fascinating and quite unique about China, talking about this, is that the country and the leadership seems to be able to predict and identify industries and areas that will matter a lot in the future, and into which it makes sense to invest so that they can later dominate them and reap the benefits. Whether it's becoming the world's manufacturing base, investing into electric car industry, securing the rare minerals in Africa for that industry, and so on. And that's not typically something that countries are able to do. Why do you think that China is able to do that when so many countries are not? Or is that more of an organic development rather than sitting down and carefully planning it out?
I am a skeptic of planning, and I think the scenario that you lay out is accurate. But let me offer a reframing of that. I think that they have not dominated particular technologies that they set their minds to target. I think they have essentially targeted every major industry that they and most of the rest of the world, frankly, believe is important. So, in the most notorious plan, Made in China 2025, which Beijing identified in 2015, the Communist Party and the State Council essentially said, what are the technologies of the future? It is things like semiconductors and AI and electric vehicles and maritime technologies, which is essentially what a lot of Americans were saying at the time as well. And then they said, we're going to invest in essentially all of them. And they have displayed patience. They have displayed tremendous risk tolerance. There have been outright scams and all sorts of frauds in China related especially to semiconductors. And the way they've dealt with that is to have arrested and detained and sometimes, in some cases, sentenced to death some of the executives involved in some of the frauds involved in semiconductors, and essentially continue pushing forward after refining the system. It wasn't to identify a lot of frauds and then pull the plug on all of these different developments. And I think I would say that a lot of the organization of getting rare earths or getting oil was a pretty market-driven organic development. So if China is the center of the world's battery industry for both consumer electronics as well as for electric vehicles, and we know that most of the world's cobalt is in the DRC of Congo, and cobalt is a critical ingredient in a lot of high-powered batteries. Then it becomes quite easy for a lot of Chinese companies to say, well, let's go buy a bunch of cobalt and let's own quite a lot of the mines in Congo. Same goes with oil. They're purchasing oil because they need oil, not because the central planners told them to. So I think that I'm always reluctant to attribute too much success to the state. I think that the Chinese state is bureaucratically better organized and in some ways more competent and in some cases more patient and more forward-looking. But I would say that for the most part, it resembles most other big states, which have all sorts of short-term impatiences, make all sorts of horrible mistakes, look absurd in a million different ways. There's more that unites China's government to other systems than that separates from it.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important, but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. But still, I understand it as, in other words, what you're saying is that it's not that they know better where the future is going, but that they are better at following through and maybe actually putting the money where their mouth is.
They're better at following through. Once they say they're going to do something like master semiconductors, they keep at it and don't give up because they know that this is important. They have better risk tolerance relative to the American system, which is really obsessed with the failure of a single solar case, a company called Solyndra, which went bust. And then Republicans said, well, this proves that industrial policy can never work anywhere. And the Chinese are also, in addition to being much more committed, in addition to being more organized, they also are, in some cases, more patient. They do understand that something like Airbus in Europe was created in part through industrial subsidies over a matter of decades. It wasn't at all an overnight success. And so they have some of the same European tenacity and patience in trying to nurture an industry until it really grows.
Do you think that the cliche that people often say about China and about Chinese leadership, that while in democracies we have this view that the only thing that matters are the next 4 years before the government changes, and that kind of limits our ability to plan long term, while China, as it's often said, has the ability to plan long term and has the ability to make these grand long term visions. Do you think that's actually true, or just one of the things that people say but doesn't really have much connection to reality?
It has a grain of truth, but I think that parts of it is true, and I am always afraid of overstating the competence of the Chinese state, because I think that one can. They are generally more patient, and they do have greater intent to win in a way that I think is not necessarily true of a lot of Americans. But I think you can find plenty of cases in which success did not grow out of the plan. So most of the Chinese advances in consumer electronics was not planned for by the central government. That was just a lot of entrepreneurs working in Shenzhen, turbocharged by Apple to produce a lot of electronics. And this is partly the reason that China is now the global leader in things that include drones as well as electric vehicle batteries. And I think that there are also examples of Chinese successes that didn't grow out of the plan. For example, the high-speed rail development. It was completely absent from the 5-year plan that was just released before construction got underway. But then the global financial crisis happened, and a very ambitious rail boss decided that this was the moment to build huge amounts of rail, convinced enough of the leadership to do so. And then they went on a giant building spree when this wasn't even really planned. You can take a look at some of these plans and see that a lot of the planning has been obvious failures. China forever has wanted to have an automotive industry organized like the US or Japan or Germany, which have essentially 3 big automakers among them each. And China always tried to have something like this. Never really worked. Try to force foreign companies to give local companies technology. These local companies simply got very lazy and were not very innovative. And so I think that there is a planning impulse. I think that there is a patience virtue. I think there is a lot of funding, but the planning track record is deeply, deeply mixed.
One thing that I sort of kept thinking, maybe going back to your original argument about China being an engineering society, one thing I kept thinking was that a lot of what you're saying about China could also be said about the former Soviet Union, because it was also a society of engineers. It was very prestigious profession and education. Many leaders had engineering background. There was a lot of focus on it in education, and the state also tended to look at the economy and society as systems that you can engineer to your will. And obviously there's a lot of differences between the two systems as well. But it seems that it's working out a lot better for China than it did for the Soviets. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be, and maybe the similarities in both of those societies being engineering societies?
Yeah. Well, China is much more successful than the Soviet Union for several reasons. First, China has a much more functional economy than the Soviets did. Soviets never really developed much of a vibrant consumer economy, for example, because they focused everything on heavy industry and steel production. And I think there's a historical experience of how long did the Russians actually have to suffer through communism. It's something like on the scale of 75 years from the Bolshevik Revolution all the way until the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And how many years did the Chinese actually suffer through true communism? And this time span is far shorter. It's basically, I would argue, something like between 1950 to 1980, perhaps, maybe a little bit longer than that. But it's essentially, I would say, about a third of the amount of time that the Soviets actually had to suffer through communism. And so, when you're the less communist you have to be, the better off I think you are. And the Chinese have studied essentially two big countries before them. Mostly, maybe they studied three big countries. The first is the failure of the Soviet Union, the failure of their political reform. The second was the relative failure of Japan in not climbing up the technological ladder and allowing a financial and property crisis to immolate the broader economy. And then they also study the United States because they understand that the United States is the top dog, it's the winner, and they need to be better at winning rather than losing like the Soviets. And so the fact that we had a Soviet experience, the fact that we had a Gorbachev that managed to implode the system and then restrain it from getting up again, is some indication that the Chinese will not repeat exactly the same mistakes. They're probably going to repeat new and different mistakes, and it's going to be something that we can't quite predict. But I think it will not be a straightforward repeat of the Soviet example.
To follow up on that, you could see another similarity between the two in the fact that the USSR was able to do some of the same things as China, to identify strategic areas and industries and then funnel a ton of resources into that. And if you look at the history, it actually worked quite well short term. And for a while, the USSR was able to keep up with the US in science and in technology and industry. But eventually they just fell behind because they couldn't keep up with the level of innovation and adaptation as the US did. Do you think that China, with the system that it has been able to develop, which is a merger of capitalism and state-controlled economy, do you think they found a way to avoid that and avoid following the same fate as the USSR?
Yes, but I think that doesn't mean that they will succeed, broadly speaking, and they may have other failures, just failures that they couldn't quite foresee and couldn't quite plan for. So I don't believe that China's economy is on the verge of collapse. I don't believe that it is a very fragile system. I don't believe that economic growth is the only thing that people want, and if the Communist Party doesn't deliver it, then the people will turf out the party. I think these are simplifications I disagree with. But I think that you can certainly point to giant problems with China's economy. They're facing an imploding property sector. Consumers aren't spending very much. Youth unemployment is high. A lot of the economy is inefficient in terms of being state-owned or state-directed in some way. There's longer-term demographic issues, and the political system seems not that much more sophisticated, I would say, than Stalin's, for example. So, authoritarian systems have a really hard time figuring out succession planning. And it's far from obvious that Xi Jinping has figured it out. In fact, it seems quite likely that he has not figured it out. So, given all of these facts together, one can paint a picture of failure for China. It's not my expectation. I think that China's political system is pretty robust, and their economic system is also robust, and they'll be able to figure out a lot of these challenges. But I don't discount the idea that these challenges could overwhelm the system. But in the same way that you could make a lot of these cases for the United States or Europe as well, that in some ways it seems like the Europeans, from my perspective, even though we have the madness of the second Trump administration, the Europeans don't seem to be doing so hot either in terms of an even more dysfunctional economy and populist parties that are outpolling incumbent ruling parties pretty much everywhere, and at a much lower standard of income. I'm wondering whether it is going to be the case that, now my main point is that if one wanted to create ugly pictures. One can do that absolutely everywhere. The Chinese are not immune to this. I don't think that they've figured out some magic code. At the same time, my expectation is not for them to collapse very easily.
As a European, I agree that we're definitely going through something. I think the difference is that no one expects Europe to emerge in the end as the winner, as people may expect from the US or China. Um, I think talking about that, who will emerge as a winner, there is an argument that I've always thought makes a lot of sense that in the long term, state controlled authoritarian economies like that of China can never be competitive and innovative as much as liberal capitalist democracies, because over the long term, things like lack of freedom and lack of predictable rule of law and rules that apply for everyone and the state control actually stifle the innovation. And I've always find it kind of confusing how China is able to be so successful without having any of those things. So do you think that China is proving this assumption wrong, or is it something that might still catch up with it at some point later down the line?
Yeah, I think that it has proved the assumption wrong. I think that is relatively straightforward. That I think that China's economic system feels pretty vibrant and competitive. And frankly, it is far more competitive than the capitalism that's being practiced in the US or Europe now. So, and I mean, one common statistic that I like to reach for now is that, there's something like over 100 electric vehicle companies in China. And the product cycle of bringing a vehicle out in Germany from conceptualizing the design to actually getting it to the market is something like 6 years. In China, it's something like 18 months to 2 years. And so they just iterate on a much faster timescale because the landscape is so competitive. You take a look at the solar industry. There's dozens of big solar photovoltaic makers, and all of them making pretty much the same product, all of them fighting for pennies. And so there's a competition there that is far more ruthless, in part because there's just so many people that market entry is actually relatively straightforward. They are looking all the time for great ideas of what to do, and they are picking up all of these ideas that are not being executed with sufficient ferocity in Europe or the US, and they're picking it up to run with it. And what I always wonder about is, can we take a look at that society and say that it is somehow not innovative? Well, it is not quite the case that they brought out something like as important as the ChatGPT or something like the iPhone. There was always a first mover, but China is able to fast follow pretty quickly. And there are plenty of industries that the Americans invented, something like solar, for example, that the Americans never really got around to owning and dominating. And it took first the Germans and then the Chinese really to perfect solar photovoltaics into a broader mass manufactured product. And I would say that that is every part an innovative agenda as anything that Silicon Valley does, where I'm speaking to you now from Stanford University. I think that the Chinese are able to do things mostly more through copying. But where that matters is that they own industries and the Americans don't. And I feel that the Europeans are also giving up some of their industries that they innovated on because they can't hold on to it.
Yeah, I mean, the automotive industry and especially the electric car industry is the prime example of that. I wonder, you make the argument that it's not just about, or it's actually less about the state and state planning than we think, and more about the Chinese entrepreneurs and the very competitive entrepreneurial environment. Do you think that, because that was my assumption as well, do you think that the fact that China has in recent years cracked down on its entrepreneurs, on the big entrepreneurial celebrities, but also on a lot of smaller industries and companies as well, do you think that that is something that might have negative effects, or is it something that doesn't actually matter that much in the big picture?
I think it definitely has negative effects, but I think it is not enough to overwhelm the broader entrepreneurial tendency of Chinese. That a lot of people in China really want money, and a lot of people really want to become someone like Jack Ma. Jack Ma was the biggest celebrity that Xi Jinping took down in 2020. For a few years, he disappeared. He didn't have was out of the public eye. Mostly, he was seemed to be eating sushi in Japan and just enjoying a good life over there. But he is still a billionaire, and over the past year, he seems to have gotten himself back into the political favor. He had a meeting and a handshake with Xi Jinping earlier this year, and he is now making grand public pronouncements about the inevitable advancements of Chinese tech once more. And so I think that these things go up and down. The Communist Party state every so often becomes Marxist and then terrorize all the private owners of capital. But that is also a story that the Chinese have gotten used to, that I think anyone who's been to China would understand that the amount of control that the Communist Party has throughout the vast society is at best tenuous. I mean, it is able to do a lot, but it cannot win hearts and minds of everyone at all times. And so I think there is still plenty of room for negotiability in China. And therefore, there is scope for doing well and scope for trying to make a lot of money, because that's what a lot of Chinese want. Now, I don't find that a lot of Europeans have this urge to make just a ton of money. But I think that that impulse is still very much alive among Americans and Chinese.
I do agree with what you said. Maybe to just pick up on your remarks about the Europeans, I do think that Europe is going through a bit of a moment out of which I think we might emerge a little bit better than before, because I feel like we might hit a bit of a rock bottom from which won't be any other way than up. Or maybe I'm wrong. But to maybe just follow up on what you said, another one of my assumptions about China has been, and I guess you might tear that down as well, has been that in the 90s in China, there has been a lot of loosening of the rules and state control, which is when the boom of the economy began. And over the past years recently, China has been going in the opposite direction under Xi Jinping, and it's going towards more state control over the economy rather than less. And my assumption was that this would therefore logically mean that the economy would run into more challenges and might do worse. But now that we're talking about how you see it, that might not be the case, I would assume would be your answer.
Yeah, well, I won't tear down that assumption too hard. I mean, I think you are broadly right that the economic rules have been loosening since the 1980s, and then perhaps over the last 15 years, even before she took office, but they have stopped loosening in some ways. But I think the way that I would think about why China has continued to do well is that sometimes it's not about the formal rules themselves. Maybe rules have stopped loosening, but Chinese firms are just at a generally much more competitive level, such that they are just competing amongst themselves and competing for exports and are trying to do better in all sorts of ways. That Chinese, who are much better integrated with the rest of the world, are always interested in what's going on in Silicon Valley, which is an admiration that is not exactly being repaid, because Silicon Valley, I think, is pretty ignorant of what is going on in China. And furthermore, it's not just about some of these formal rules that govern the Chinese economy. It is also just about the level of dynamism that exists in society. That it is not only that beyond the rules that the state has been funding a lot more science and technology. That a lot of science and technology requires giant state funds to prosper, and the state has made many more of these funds available to an extent that is coming close to the American level of funding for its sciences. And, by just throwing a lot more money at the problem and having more capital, could get further. And so, I think the part of the economy that I'm always looking at is essentially the top 5% of the highly functional economy, and those companies are very, very competitive. Maybe 50% of China's economy is pretty dysfunctional, which is much more state managed. But so long as that 5% is functional, they may do very well on automotives. They may do very well on semiconductors. They may do very well on aviation, as well as consumer electronics. And so having 5% of the manufacturing sector go might be enough to deindustrialize Germany as well as much of the EU.
So I think talking about the Chinese economy, I feel like when I talk to China experts, and even just generally in the media, I feel like there are sort of two competing and very different ideas or visions for what China's economy looks like today and what it will look like in the future, and what that means for China's role and status in the world. And the first one is very critical to China, and it's focusing on its demographic issues and the massive debt that China has and the overbuilding and the real estate bubble. And basically, the argument is that there are huge problems for China on the horizon that anyone would really struggle dealing with. And then you have a completely different vision that is very optimistic, and it's focusing on what you were just talking about, on the 5% of the top performing companies that are dominating the world, and that China has this enormous manufacturing capacity, and that it's leading all these industries, and it has all these STEM and math graduates and so on. And completely opposite to the first one, it claims that China is actually in the best possible position to dominate the global economy in the future. And personally, I tend to kind of agree with both, and I think it both make sense. But I'm not sure which one is more accurate at all. And I think it's really confusing for people who are watching China from the outside but don't know that much about it. So where do you stand on that? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.